Part 1. The American prototype that should have been forgotten. The Mojave Desert, California. Late summer, 1951. Was supposed to be nothing. A footnote. A line item in a budget report that would eventually be redacted, filed, and incinerated. The air over the dry lake bed shimmered with a relentless, oppressive heat, the kind that warped the horizon and made the distant Joshua trees look like twisting specters. On the tarmac, heat waves rose from the asphalt in visible curtains, distorting the silhouette of a machine that looked less like the future of aviation and more like a desperate gamble. It was the XP model, a designation that doesn't matter anymore, because the history books largely chose to ignore it. It sat heavy on its landing gear, an awkward amalgamation of captured German swept-wing data and American brute force engineering. It was ugly, unpolished, and temperamental. It leaked hydraulic fluid like a wounded animal, leaving dark, iridescent puddles on the concrete that the ground crews had to constantly scrub away. The casual observer, it was just another jet in an era obsessed with jets. But to the men standing in the shadow of the control tower, arms crossed, shirts stained with sweat, it was a headache that wouldn't go away. This was the American prototype that vibrated, stalled, overheated, and was quietly scrapped before it ever reached full testing. The test pilot, a man named Miller who had flown P-51s over Europe and had the scar tissue to prove it, hated the thing. He didn't just dislike it, he loathed it with a visceral, professional intensity. Climbing into the cockpit wasn't stepping into a machine, it was strapping himself to a bomb that hadn't quite decided when to go off. It feels, Miller had said after the third aborted taxi run, spitting grit from his teeth, like the tail is trying to divorce the nose. Engineers laughed at it. It was a nervous laughter, the kind that fills a room when brilliant men realize they have built something incredibly stupid. The center of gravity was wrong. The intake conceptualization was too ambitious for the metallurgy of the day. The engine, a primitive turbojet that screamed like a banshee and drank fuel like a sailor, had a nasty habit of surging when the throttle was pushed past 80%. On the final day of testing, the order was simple. Take it to 30,000 feet, push the nose over, and see what happens. Miller took it up. The ground crew watched through binoculars, shielding their eyes against the glare. They saw the contrail trace a shaky white line against the brutal blue of the sky. They heard the roar, distant and thundering. And then, they heard the silence. At 32,000 feet, the prototype didn't just stall, it convulsed. The airframe shuddered so violently that the instrument panel blurred into a meaningless gray smear before Miller's eyes. The stick kicked back against his palm with enough force to bruise bone. The engine temperature gauges spiked into the red, stayed there for a terrifying second, and then the compressor stalled with a loud bang that echoed inside the cockpit like a gunshot. Miller dropped the nose, fought the spin, and brought the screaming metal brick back to the hard deck. He didn't even taxi to the hangar. He stopped on the runway, popped the canopy, and climbed out. He threw his helmet on the ground. He was done. The Air Force tossed it aside without a second thought. The project was cancelled 48 hours later. The airframe was stripped of its avionics and engines. The carcass was hauled to a scrap yard behind the base, where it would sit, rusting, gathering dust, a home for desert scorpions and a monument to wasted tax dollars. The files, boxes of telemetry data, pilot reports, and structural stress analysis, were stamped, terminated, boxed up, and shoved into the back of a damp archive room in Washington. It was over. A failure. A dead end. And yet, months later, and 5,000 miles away, Soviet intelligence panicked. The Lubyanka Building, Moscow winter, 1952. The atmosphere inside the hushed offices of the Soviet Technical Intelligence Bureau was the polar opposite of the Mojave. It was cold, smelling of stale tobacco smoke, wet wool, and fear. Failure wasn't just a career setback, it was a potential death sentence. Internal memos began to appear on the desks of the highest-ranking aviation ministers. They were typed on thick, rough paper, stamped with the red ink of maximum classification. The Americans have surpassed our high-altitude performance, one report read, the Cyrillic characters stark and accusatory. Their new prototype exposes critical weaknesses in our design. The panic wasn't theatrical, it was quiet and deadly. In the design bureaus of Mikoyan and Gurevich, in the wind tunnels of TSAGI, the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute, the mood shifted from competitive tension to outright alarm. But the US hadn't built anything new. They couldn't have. The program was dead. The pilots were back to flying sabers. The engineers had moved on to the Century Series fighters. Why were the Soviets terrified of a plane that didn't even work? Why did general secretaries and marshals of the Air Force lose sleep over a machine that was currently collecting rust in a desert boneyard? What did they think America had discovered? The disconnect seems impossible. How could a rejected, failed airframe expose one of the USSR's biggest aviation lies? How could a piece of junk convince the Kremlin that they were losing the sky? The answer begins with one flaw. A flaw American engineers dismissed as a manufacturing error, a glitch, a symptom of a bad design. But Soviet designers, staring at the stolen data under the harsh light of a desk lamp, could no longer hide from the truth. Part 2. The failure. No one bothered to study Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Archive Division. To understand the panic, you have to understand the data. The prototype's biggest flaw was simple, or so the Americans thought: severe high-altitude instability. It was a coffin corner nightmare. Above 9,000 meters, roughly 29,500 feet, the aircraft didn't just fly poorly, it became possessed. The aerodynamic flow over the wings detached in unpredictable patterns. The nose would pitch down, then snap up. The vibrations were harmonic and destructive, shaking the rivets loose. Test pilots compared it to flying inside a paint mixer. It was a colorful description for a terrifying reality: aeroelastic flutter. If you shook the plane hard enough, the wings would simply snap off. America shelved the design immediately because it was dangerous and uncontrollable. They saw the instability as a failure of the airframe to handle the air. They assumed the wings were too flexible, or the tail authority was too weak. They blamed the junk engineering. But one engineer, a junior analyst named Roberts, a man who wore thick glasses and preferred numbers to people, archived the telemetry before the program died. He didn't analyze it, he just saved it. He put the rolls of graph paper and the oscilloscope printouts into a folder marked XP79 anomalies. And this is where the story turns. Because hidden inside that data was something the Americans didn't notice. They were too busy looking at the vibration to look at why it was vibrating. They were too focused on the failure of the pilot to control the plane to look at the environment the plane was moving through. But Soviet designers, who obtained copies of these reports through a network of espionage that reached deep into the defense contracting industry, couldn't afford to ignore it. They laid the American charts side by side with their own. They looked at the curves representing airspeed, altitude, and dynamic pressure, and their blood ran cold. The instability didn't come from a weak engine or bad aerodynamics. It came from compressibility effects at speeds the plane technically shouldn't have been able to reach. Compressibility is the invisible wall of aviation. As an aircraft approaches the speed of sound, air stops behaving like a fluid and starts behaving like a solid. It compresses. Shock waves form on the wings. These shock waves destroy lift and hammer the control surfaces. The American data showed the prototype suffering from massive compressibility buffeting. The numbers made no sense. According to the flight log, the American plane was flying at Mach 0.82 when the instability hit. But the Soviet engineers looked at the vibration frequency. They looked at the pressure distribution data. These weren't the signatures of Mach 0.82. These were the signatures of Mach 0.96. Unless the instruments were broken, the prototype had momentarily exceeded the speed Soviet fighters claimed to reach. The Soviet analysts realized that the American pilot, in his struggle to control the plane, had likely entered a shallow dive. In that dive, despite the bad engine and the draggy airframe, the plane had accelerated into the transonic zone, that deadly area just below the speed of sound. The Americans saw a plane shaking itself to death and thought, bad plane. The Soviets saw a plane shaking itself to death and thought, fast plane. If a rejected American prototype could accidentally stumble into the transonic zone, pushed there by sheer aerodynamic efficiency or raw engine thrust that the Americans weren't even bragging about, then what were the real American fighters capable of? The Soviet Union had been telling the world, and its own pilots, that their MiGs were the kings of the high altitude. They claimed their swept-wing designs had solved the compressibility issue. They claimed they could fight at Mach 0.9 without loss of control. But here was the terrifying truth hidden in the American failure. The Americans had scrapped a plane for instability, at speeds the Soviets were struggling to even touch without their own jets falling out of the sky. The American failure occurred at a performance threshold that the Soviets considered the absolute cutting edge. If this was America's garbage, then the USSR was decades behind. The panic in Moscow wasn't about the XP-79. It was about what the XP-79 represented. It was the realization that the American standard for failure was higher than the Soviet standard for success. And it meant that every high-altitude interception strategy the Soviet air defense forces had drawn up was based on a lie. They had assumed American bombers and fighters would be limited by the same physics that limited the MiGs. The vibrating, stalling, overheating prototype proved them wrong. It proved that the Americans were surfing the shock waves that were drowning the Soviets. And the Americans didn't even know they had done it. The folder didn't look like a weapon. It wasn't encased in steel or wired with explosives. It was a nondescript, beige dossier, stained with the residue of a hurried coffee spill and smelling faintly of damp wool and cheap tobacco. It had traveled thousands of miles, passed from hand to greasy hand, from a waste bin in a contractor's office in California, to a safe house in Mexico City, to a diplomatic pouch in Vienna, and finally, to this heavy oak desk in Moscow. Outside, the gray winter of 1952 pressed against the frosted glass. Inside, the air was thick with the tension that only exists in rooms where men realize they have made a fatal miscalculation. Senior analyst Andrei Volkov stared at the photostats spread out before him. They were grainy, high-contrast copies of American telemetry logs. To a layman, they were just jagged lines on a graph. But to Volkov, a man who had spent 20 years studying the invisible violence of air moving over metal, they were a confession. When Soviet intelligence stole fragments of the scrapped aircraft's test logs, they expected to find confirmation of American incompetence. They expected to see a catalog of failures that would justify the Kremlin's arrogant stance on air superiority. Instead, something snapped inside the collective psyche of the aviation ministry. For years, the Soviet propaganda machine, and the design bureaus that fed it, had boasted of a singular, unassailable fact: the motherland owned the transonic regime. They claimed that the new MiG variants had solved the compressibility crisis. They told the generals that their swept-wing fighters could pierce the sound barrier's doorstep without losing control. The West is heavy, the political officers would say during briefings. Their jets are bloated with luxuries. Ours are pure. Ours are fast. But the American data, lying stark and silent on the desk, showed something impossible. It showed the American XP prototype, that rejected, vibrating, overheating disaster, entering a dive. It showed the drag coefficient spiking. It showed the control surfaces fluttering. And then, it showed the speed. Even a broken, overweight prototype, in the hands of a pilot trying to save his own life, had briefly surpassed the USSR's official maximum speed. Volkov took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The silence in the room was deafening. If a rejected US plane, a machine the Americans considered garbage, could accidentally punch into a speed regime that Soviet pilots were forbidden to touch, then the Soviets had been lying. They had been lying to their pilots, young men who climbed into cockpits believing they had the fastest machines on Earth. They had been lying to their generals, who drew up invasion plans based on interception rates that were pure fantasy. And most dangerously, they had been lying to themselves. The realization rippled through the hierarchy like a shockwave. It started in the analysis labs of SAGI, the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute. Engineers gathered in hushed clusters around the stolen graphs. They pulled out slide rules. They rechecked the conversions from feet to meters, praying for a math error. There was no error. One senior engineer at SAGI, a man who had survived the purges by keeping his head down and his mouth shut, finally broke the silence. He drafted a memo, his hand trembling slightly as the nib of his fountain pen scratched across the paper. If the Americans reached this regime unintentionally, he wrote, choosing his words with the care of a man defusing a bomb, then our declarations cannot be defended. We are viewing a failure that exceeds our theoretical limit. We are not ahead. We are not even close. The USSR's biggest fear wasn't the aircraft itself. The XP-79 was dead. It would never drop a bomb on Moscow. The fear was exposure. The Soviet aviation industry was built on a foundation of bravado and ruthlessly enforced optimism. To admit that the Americans were casually discarding technology that was superior to the Soviet Union's best efforts would be to admit a systemic rot. It would shatter the illusion of socialist infallibility. If the Kremlin found out that the design bureaus had been overpromising and under-delivering for 5 years, the consequences wouldn't just be fired. It would be the Gulag. Part 4. The investigation. The KGB tried to bury the Kremlin, behind closed doors early spring, 1952. The reaction was swift, brutal, and entirely secret. The Soviet High Command didn't broadcast their panic. They didn't scramble jets. They launched a secret internal review, code-named Operation Zerkalo, Mirror. It was an inquisition. Men in long leather coats arrived at the design bureaus. They weren't engineers. They were auditors of loyalty. They seized logbooks. They grounded test squadrons. They pulled engines off the test stands and subjected them to brutal, destructive testing that the designers had conveniently avoided. The investigation peeled back the layers of varnish that had covered the Soviet aviation program. Under the harsh light of the KGB's scrutiny, the glorious statistics began to dissolve. The review concluded three devastating things, facts that had been whispered in canteen corners but never written down. 1. The engine myth. Their engine output figures had been inflated. The Klimov engines, derived from British Rolls-Royce Nene technology sold to them in a moment of Western naivete, were robust but limited. To meet the party's speed demands, designers had authorized over-temperature limits that melted turbine blades after only a few hours of use. The maximum thrust, listed in the manuals, was a suicide setting. 2. The paper tiger. Their fighters' published speed was theoretical, not tested. The designers had calculated what the plane should do based on drag curves and thrust ratios. But they hadn't actually flown it there. Why? Because every time a test pilot got close to Mach 0.92, the aircraft tried to kill him. The official top speed was a number that existed only on paper. 3. The death wobble. Their high-altitude controls were dangerously unstable. The investigation uncovered a series of training accidents that had been written off as pilot error. In reality, they were identical to the American prototype's failure. At high altitudes, the Soviet wings lost lift asymmetry. The jets would enter a snaking oscillation, yawing left and right violently until the airframe disintegrated. The Americans had stumbled into the truth by accident, a truth the USSR had covered up for years. The irony was bitter. The Americans had scrapped their plane because they demanded perfection. They saw the instability as a sign that they needed to do better. The Soviets saw the same instability in their own jets and decided to simply hide it. If the West discovered this, if NATO realized that the terrifying red swarm of MiGs was actually a fleet of fragile, unstable machines that couldn't fight at top speed, Soviet air superiority propaganda would collapse. The deterrent value of the Soviet Air Force would evaporate. So instead of fixing the problem, which would take years of research and admit a humiliating gap in capability, they tried to bury it. The order came from the very top: sanitize the record. Documents were classified at the highest level, special importance. Test failures were pulled from the archives and incinerated in the furnaces of the Lubyanka. Engineers who knew the true performance limits were forced to sign silence orders that carried the implicit threat of treason charges for violation. They rewrote the pilot manuals. They lowered the recommended red line speeds, burying the change in dense technical jargon about fuel conservation and airframe longevity. They told the pilots to fly slower, not because the planes couldn't handle the speed, but to preserve the glory of the people's machinery. But it was already too late. The truth was out there, sitting in a scrapyard in the Mojave Desert. The Americans had the only evidence they needed, inside a plane they threw away. They possessed the physical proof of the transonic barrier's violence, and by studying their own failure, they were already designing the solution. The area rule, fuselage, the all-flying tail, innovations that would leave the Soviet Union chasing ghosts for the next decade. While the KGB was busy burning papers to hide the past, American engineers were already building the future, using the very data they had once dismissed as garbage. Part 5. When the Americans finally looked again. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio Foreign Technology Division, November, 1952. The Mojave dust had long since been washed off the landing gear of the scrapped prototype. The airframe itself was likely already cut into sections, melted down, and repurposed into toaster ovens or siding for suburban houses. The pilot, Miller, had moved on to newer, faster, less suicidal jets. The program was dead, buried under 6 feet of bureaucratic indifference. But data has a way of surviving long after the metal has corroded. It sat in a cardboard box in the basements of Wright-Patterson, misfiled between hydraulic pump failures 1949 and canteen supply requisitions. It should have stayed there. By all rights, the flight logs of a failed airplane are the most worthless documents in the history of aviation. But the Cold War was a voracious beast. It fed on information, and in late 1952, the United States Air Force was hungry for data on a specific, nagging problem: tail flutter. Newer jets, the ones that were actually supposed to work, were shaking their tails off. The F-100 Super Sabre was in development, and engineers were terrified of the vertical stabilizer snapping at high speeds. They needed a baseline. They needed to know what bad looked like so they could engineer good. So, a mid-level analyst named Robert Harrison was sent down to the archives. He wasn't a spy. He wasn't a visionary. He was a man who wore short-sleeved shirts with a tie, drank lukewarm coffee, and possessed the infinite patience required to stare at oscillating lines on graph paper for 10 hours a day. He pulled the dusty box marked XP-79 terminated. He didn't care about the plane's top speed. He didn't care about the engine temperature. He was looking for one thing: vibration frequency in the tail section. He spread the telemetry charts out on his desk. The room was quiet, save for the hum of a fluorescent light and the distant drone of a propeller plane taking off outside. Harrison ran his finger along the jagged peaks of the vibration graph. It was exactly what he expected: a mess. The plane had been shaking so hard it was a miracle the pilot survived. He made a few notes, ready to close the file and move on to lunch. But then, his eye drifted. On the edge of the chart, parallel to the vibration data, was the airspeed readout. Harrison stopped. He squinted. He wiped his glasses and looked again. The line representing airspeed didn't just climb, it spiked. It shot upward in a vertical violation of physics, right at the moment the plane entered its terminal instability. Sensor error, Harrison muttered to himself. That was the standard explanation. When a plane shakes that hard, the pitted tubes, the sensors that measure airspeed, usually vibrate loose or get clogged with turbulent air. They give false readings. They lie. He reached for a red pencil to circle the error, to mark it as data corruption. But his hand hovered over the paper. Harrison was a creature of habit, but he was also a creature of thoroughness. If the airspeed sensor was broken, the other instruments should have shown chaos, too. He flipped to the page showing barometric pressure and manifold pressure. If the plane had just been vibrating in place, the air pressure around the nose cone should have remained relatively stable. It hadn't. At the exact second the airspeed spiked, the local air pressure plummeted. Harrison frowned. He pulled out a slide rule. He did a quick, dirty calculation on a scrap of notepad paper. Bernoulli's principle: as velocity increases, pressure decreases. If the airspeed reading was a glitch, the pressure reading should have been normal. If the pressure reading was a glitch, the airspeed should have been normal. But they both moved in perfect, terrifying synchronization. A sudden speed spike, a violent compressibility shock, a momentary, impossible dip in air pressure. The math was screaming a conclusion that Harrison's brain refused to accept. The instruments weren't broken. The vibration hadn't caused the sensors to fail. The speed had caused the vibration. For a terrifying window of perhaps 4 seconds, while the pilot was fighting to keep the nose from tucking under, that clunky, rejected, failed prototype had stopped flying like a 1940s jet and started flying like a missile. It hadn't just approached the sound barrier. It had leaned its weight against the door. Harrison sat back in his chair. The coffee in his mug had gone cold. He looked around the empty office, wondering if anyone else understood what this piece of paper was saying. The XP-79 hadn't failed because it was too slow. It had failed because the Americans had built an engine powerful enough to push a bad airframe faster than the laws of aerodynamics allowed. He inserted a fresh sheet of paper into his typewriter. The keys clacked loudly in the silence. He wasn't writing a manifesto. He wasn't writing a declaration of war. He was writing a technical footnote in a report about tail stabilizers. He typed a single, understated sentence. Analysis of terminal flight data suggests that, prior to flow separation, the prototype briefly achieved velocities in excess of Mach 0.96. He paused, then added the kicker. If this spike is correct, the prototype briefly outperformed current intelligence estimates of Soviet fighter capability. He filed the report. He went to lunch. He likely never thought about it again. But that single piece of paper didn't stay in Ohio. The Cold War was a sieve. Information leaked through the cracks of bureaucracy. A carbon copy of that report made its way to the Pentagon. A summary was included in a briefing for the CIA. And somewhere in the dark, tangled web of espionage, that summary was intercepted. To Harrison, it was a curiosity. To the Kremlin, it was a thunderclap. When that sentence reached Moscow, the reaction was not academic interest. It was pure, distilled horror. The Soviet analysts didn't see a glitch. They didn't see a sensor error. They saw confirmation. They had spent years telling the world that the MiG-15 and its successors were the masters of the high transonic regime. They had claimed that American technology was heavy, sluggish, and incapable of matching Soviet aerodynamics. But here was an American analyst, bored and indifferent, casually noting that a garbage American plane, a plane they'd thrown in the trash, had gone faster than the pride of the Soviet Air Force. What the US considered a manufacturing defect, the USSR saw as an exposed lie. If a failed American experiment could accidentally hit Mach 0.96, then the Americans weren't just ahead. They were ahead by so much that they didn't even realize they were winning. The Soviets realized with sinking hearts that they were in a poker game where their opponent had thrown away a royal flush because he thought he was playing Go Fish. And if the Americans ever realized what they had actually built, if they ever decided to stop scrapping these designs and start refining them, the sky would no longer belong to the hammer and sickle. Davis Monthan Air Force Base, the Boneyard, Arizona, 1953. In the end, the failed prototype never flew again. There was no ceremony. There was no final salute from the ground crew, no brass band playing as it was towed away. The end came with the mundane scratching of a pen on a disposition of material form. The aircraft that had inadvertently terrified the Kremlin was dragged unceremoniously across the tarmac to the cutting torches. It sat in the Arizona sun, stripped of its dignity. The canopy was gone, salvaged for spare plexiglass. The engines, those troublesome, surging beasts, had been pulled out and shipped to a technical school in Texas for mechanics to practice on. What remained was a skeleton. A welder named Kowalski, who had no idea he was cutting up a machine of geopolitical significance, lit his acetylene torch. The blue flame hissed. He lowered his goggles and began to slice through the main spar of the wing. The very had fluttered so violently it convinced Soviet intelligence that the Americans had mastered the impossible. Sparks showered onto the dry earth. The aluminum groaned as the structural tension was released for the last time. It never entered production. It never fired a shot in anger. It never defended a bomber or intercepted a spy plane. Its parts were sold as scrap metal. The high-grade aluminum that had once vibrated at Mach 0.96 was melted down into ingots. It was likely recycled into siding for suburban homes in Levittown, or stamped into the bodies of Chevy Bel Airs, or formed into soda cans. The physical reality of the plane was erased. But in the shadowed corridors of Moscow, the ghost of the machine refused to die. Its accidental speed spike forced the Soviets to confront a humiliating truth, one that couldn't be solved by burning documents or silencing engineers. The truth was mathematical, and it was unforgiving. Their fastest fighter wasn't as fast as they claimed. The MiG-15, for all its agility and climbing power, hit a brick wall at high Mach numbers. The controls locked up, the nose tucked. It was a subsonic fighter dressed in transonic clothing. The propaganda, the posters showing red stars piercing the sound barrier effortlessly, wasn't real. And their aviation leap was a myth. The panic caused by the American failure ignited a quiet revolution inside the Soviet design bureaus. It ended the era of complacency. The lethargy that had settled over the ministry was replaced by a frantic, terrified energy. Because of this scrapped American plane, the Soviets rushed the development of the MiG-19. They abandoned the thick-wing designs they had been clinging to. They began to obsess over the area rule, the pinching of the fuselage to reduce drag, years earlier than they might have otherwise. They built wind tunnels that could generate true supersonic flows, spending rubles they didn't have, driven by the fear of a phantom American capability that didn't actually exist. The American plane had done its job without ever realizing it. It had forced the enemy to blink. It had forced them to spend billions chasing a shadow. All revealed by a forgotten American aircraft that never should have mattered. History is usually written by the victors, by the aces, by the machines that worked. We remember the P-51 Mustang. We remember the F-86 Sabre. We remember the successes. But sometimes the biggest secrets don't come from triumphs. They don't come from the polished airshows or the successful test flights. They come from the failures no one expected to tell the truth. They come from the vibrating, stalling, overheating wrecks that we toss aside. Somewhere in a landfill, buried under decades of dirt, lies a piece of jagged metal that once flew too fast, shook too hard, and scared the other superpower halfway to death. It was supposed to be nothing. But in the silence of the Cold War, nothing ever truly is.